we are recording. I'm going to spotlight my video. Welcome everyone to Torah Tea, to the third class in this 6-part series. And I'm gonna mute everyone, but as I always say, feel free to unmute yourself at any time and ask any of your questions and make this a, back and forth, open, to everyone kind of a thing. Okay. I'm just going to do the muting, but of course, unmute yourself at any point. All right. I am going to share my screen. We are going to dive right in. Okay. Everyone can see that? Hold on a second. There we go. I'm going to just move that to the top. All right. Okay, so just a quick little recap of where we've been, what we've been speaking about so far, right? So actually last week we talked about advice on this idea of how to gain self-mastery. In other words, right, that a Beinoni, which is something that every single one of us can achieve. A Beinoni is somebody who is very mindful and never allows their urges and desires that are negative or against God's will to find expression in thought, speech, and action. Okay, so in other words, the animal soul is still extremely active in the Beinoni. The animal soul is still, 100% there, fighting the good fight, but it doesn't actually get to win. Okay, and we spoke about how impulse control is a universal human quality. We all have that ability to sometimes we lose it, but we all have the ability not to. We all have the ability to hold ourselves together, to control our impulses, right, in whatever capacity. And that's actually a natural, innate ability that we have as humans, right? And we did that little exercise of trying to, a minute of being a Beinoni, right? And then I gave you all the challenge to just try to have more Beinoni moments throughout the week. Did anyone have any experience with that? Did anyone do anything you want to share about having any Beinoni moments?
So I wanted to have a piece of chocolate after I finished my lunch, because I had a little bit of lunch before we started. I wanted to have a piece of chocolate. And as you and the rabbi would say, just hold off for a little minute. So didn't have a piece of chocolate. That was my impulse control.
Impulse control. Love it.
Why is having a piece of chocolate bad?
Because it's not bad. As you know, the more that we study this book, the more we see that even good things that we want to do, if we pause for a period of time, that's actually part of trying to achieve Beinoni, right? Adina?
Yes, 100%. So there's kind of, actually, this is like a different, a similar and different concept. There's two terms, I think they're actually Aramaic, but they're in Kabbalah a lot. Iskafia and ishapcha, okay? Iskafia is withholding, right? So it's kind of that. It's like, I want chocolate, and even though it's 100%, there's nothing wrong with it, and I'm not going to like use the energy to go do something bad, and I can even use the energy for something positive, right? Well, that's where right? Like it's totally fine. It's neutral non-holiness. I'm going to have iskafia. That's what it's called, right? I'm going to have iskafia, which means I'm going to hold back from having it just for that sake of like non-indulgence, like not giving in to something that is neutral. Okay, that would be iskafia, but then there is ishapcha, which is changing it over. Okay, so ishapcha could be, I am going to eat this chocolate. I'm going to make a blessing on it. It's a kosher piece of chocolate, and I'm going to use the energy from this chocolate to now really be able to like enjoy Torah and tea, right? So that could be ishapcha, and they're both different levels of divine service, and they're both amazing to use in different times. So that I think was what Nancy was explaining, right? Is this like you were kind of like using iskafia on chocolate,
Right.
Did you raise your hand because you wanted to share something?
No, all of a sudden it went dead, and I just wanted to, you can
Ooh.
put it down. I just wanted
Okay.
to know what
Is that
it was
better now?
flip. Yeah.
Okay. So it's actually interesting that, you know, even it talks about it in the Tanya, but like in olden day times, right, in past history, there would be many Jewish people that would like take on fasting, like not like the fast that we have on our calendar, but they would like take on fasting as a form of teshuvah, right? Like withholding from food used to be a very common form of divine service. I actually had a teacher in seminary the year I spent in Israel who spoke about this idea of iskafia, and maybe he shared this with us because we were a bunch of like, you know, 18-year-old girls that were very chatty. But he said, nowadays, the bigger iskafia for you is not to withhold yourself from food. It's to withhold yourself from talking during class or sharing gossip, right? In other words, I want you to use your iskafia, like eat your chocolate. Like he was saying that nowadays we don't have as much of an avodah, of a divine service connected with the iskafia of holding back from food that is okay, right? That is neutral, and to use our iskafia in other areas. Now, it doesn't mean don't, right? So I think that, Nancy, that was a perfect example, but it was just interesting how he's like, you know, I would like you girls to exercise your iskafia in your words. That was kind of how he shared it. So there we go. Now we just got another Kabbalistic concept right there in our class.
How do you spell that word? What's the word?
Iskafia. Like in English, because most Hebrew and Aramaic words spelled in English are just sort of made up.
Whatever. I just want, yeah.
Yeah, if you want to spell it in English, I would probably do Iskafia.
Iska.
Iskafia.
And what's the other word? How do you spell
Iskafia
that?
and ishapcha. So ISHAP CHA is how I would spell it.
And say it
Iskafia
again,
ishapcha.
please. Pronounce it again.
Ishapcha.
And what is that?
That is overcoming. Sorry, it would be like ishapcha is like turning over. What's a good English word? Transforming. There we go. Withholding and transforming. Yeah.
Good. I can see how that can relate. Both of those are good words to use regarding food.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So there's things where that we want to have iskafia, we want to hold ourselves back from, and there's things that we want to have ishapcha, we want to be able to transform. And then there's certain things that we don't have the ability to transform them, but somebody maybe on the level of the Rebbe, or, you know, like a very righteous person has the level of being able to have ishapcha, being able to transform. I'll give you an example. Right? So there are nigunim, are Jewish tunes, Jewish melodies, like Hasidic melodies, let's say, that are inherently holy. Like the Rebbe maybe composed them and taught them, and they are holy songs. And then there's, you know, just like the music out there, right? Whatever the music is and wherever that's coming from. So for example, the French national anthem is just whoever made that up, right? There's nothing holy about it. And the Rebbe actually turned that into a Hasidic melody, okay? The Rebbe turned that into a nigun. We sing it in Chabad all the time. And then some people hear it, they're like, isn't that the tune of the French national anthem? And we're like, oh no, that's a nigun, right? So only the Rebbe was able to use ishapcha in that scenario. I can't just like take some song, some music, and then like decide that it's now a holy song. Okay, that's already like next level concept and deep, and we are getting a little bit tangential here, but this started from, right, Nancy kind of sharing about her iskafia with food, which is great, right? Or like I was telling you about the challenge that I just gave myself, right, with the urge jar, that where I'm like trying to get, right, I have these like beads and this jar, and I'm trying to get 100 urges. Now I'm doing it to like, yeah, I guess to like manage my my urges, right, where I'm like, oh, I just want more chocolate and more cookies and more this. And I'm like, no, I can feel the feeling of wanting it and not have it. But essentially, that is what iskafia is. I'm having iskafia every time I give myself a bead instead of eat the chocolate, right? So is there anything wrong with eating the chocolate? No. But I'm withholding, right? And that does refine our soul at a certain level. Just the act of withholding, even something that is totally fine. Okay, welcome to the people who just joined us. And again, I just want you all to know that everyone's muted, but of course, at any time you can unmute yourself. and jump in with anything. Okay, so that was just like a little bit of a recap of what we started doing with last week. And maybe if you did try having some Bainani moments, like we spoke about, you took this advice to a certain point, but maybe not to like absolute perfection, right? In controlling your thought, your speech, and your actions, right? So knowing that we can be a Bainani, knowing that we actually are granted the capacity to consistently control ourselves in thought, speech, and action is great, but it's not enough, right? Because technically I could be like, great, now the Tanya should be over. Now you have self-mastery. I want you to know you can control yourself all of the time. Done. But the Tanya has many more chapters to it. So clearly we're not done. There's a lot more to learn, right? And like we said before, the Tanya is a step-by-step program. It's not just a book, it's a program. So we need to so now we have this information. What's the next problem that could arise that the Tanya now needs to address, right? And then it addresses that. And then now what's the next question that somebody could have, right? So again, like we said in class number 1, imagine somebody was coming to the Alter Rebbe with questions about self-mastery, about what's going on in their life. And then the Alter Rebbe answers. And then the person's like, yeah, but, and then the Alter Rebbe answers. And the person's like, yeah, but what about this, right? And then, so that's kind of like what we're doing here, right? So what would be the next question that you might come up with, right? If we say that the ability to control our impulses is natural, that we all have that ability, and then truly we can't really argue about, well, I lost control. How many times do I say I lost control? I just lost it, right? We can't really argue about that. So what would be your next question? If there's no such thing as I lost control, because we always have control, does any question come to mind?
Are you talking about control over your thoughts, which actually is addressed in Tanya?
Thought, speech, or action.
Right. Controlling any of those.
Yeah.
On a moment by moment basis.
Yeah. Like what if I tell you there's no such thing as losing control?
Right. Because at every moment, you can choose not to think something that might be disturbing to you. You can choose not to say something which might be more about your animal soul coming out. You could choose not to act a certain way in that moment, even though your animal part of your soul is really pushing you to do something that you know is not godly, if you will.
Yeah. So do you guys feel like, okay, great, now that I know that, I could just be abandoning all of the time?
Well, I want to say that telling somebody not to think something, that joke about don't think about the elephant that's in your room, don't tell me not to do something, and that's focusing on it. And that's one of the things why when you're telling somebody something, don't end with something. Sometimes if you call attention to what you don't want them to do, you're actually telling them to pay attention to it. So it's really hard giving directions. And I think that there are times when their emotions get so overwhelming that they can't control what they do. But I think sometimes it's harder to do. You know, I had to eat those 3 pieces of chocolate. Well, you really didn't have to. You didn't lose control. But there are other things that you do lose control with.
Okay, so I think you just hit it, right? You're like, you didn't lose control, you gave up control, right? You must, yes. In other words, if I tell you that there is no such thing as losing control because we always have the ability for control, then what must happen then is we give up control, and then we have to ask, why and how did that happen? Why and how do we give up control? Why do we get tired of being a Bainani, right? I'm like, listen, now you guys know exactly what it takes. Be a Bainani all of the time. But I would say, is being a Bainani supposed to be this awful? Because to control myself all of the time just because I have the ability to do so is extremely exhausting, right? Wouldn't it be great if we could just make a decision to be good all of the time and then just do it without any conflict, right? Think about the tzaddik has no conflict. The Bainani has conflict, but the ability to always do the right thing, right? But that sounds to me extremely exhausting, right? So it's here I need to not need to, but like I have the ability to always do the right thing, but that conflict is just going to be there all the time. And that sounds really, really exhausting. Is everyone with me? Yeah.
But we can struggle. I mean, that's what I think Tanya is teaching us. We could struggle with our animal soul and our godly soul.
Yeah.
And then because we have free will, we can choose whether thought, speech, or action, whether we act from our godly soul or whether we're acting more from our animal soul.
Right. So we have the choice, but my question is to you, like, if you have the choice, can you just all the time make the right choice?
Probably not. Otherwise, we'd be tzaddiks. Last time I checked, I don't think we know a lot of tzaddiks. We're trying to be Bainanim.
Right. So a Bainani still makes the right choice.
But
When
we,
you say
you know,
otherwise
this is,
we'd be a tzaddik, the tzaddik doesn't even have the struggle. I'm talking about you're a Bainani because you have the struggle and you're always making the right choice.
you know, if this is my opinion on this question, as they say, practice makes perfect. You keep, you know, like learning music, how to write music. You look at the black notes on the page, and well, this is how this is what I went through, and I was like, whoa, what is that? You know, this could be Cyrillic. But the more I look at it, the more I play, the more I don't even have to think about it. It's just there. It's like when the light turns red, I don't have to go, wait, green, red, which one is stop? Oh, red, stop. You know,
Yeah.
you just, it's part of you, you know, and I think about after a long career of criminal, representing criminal defendants.
Yeah.
You would be amazed at how many of my hundreds, thousands of clients over the 36 years said, I don't know, I just lost control, you know? I don't know what happened. I snapped, I lost control. And this is, you know, before a robbery, before you know, an assault, before a drug deal, whatever it is, they lost control. But if you try and do it all the time, just keep it right under your skin, I think it gets stronger and stronger. It doesn't get harder, it must get easier.
Yeah. Okay. I think you're definitely on the right track. So here's what I want you to think about, right? So as humans, right, we can use our natural ability, right, to like stifle the animal soul and stifle the animal drive, right? But if we don't get our emotions on board with our behaviors, then there's a lot of tension there. It puts us under a lot of strain, right? So I meant to bring a rubber band. I don't have a rubber band in front of me, but just imagine a rubber band, right? A stretching rubber band. Imagine one side represents your thoughts, your speech, your action, okay? And the other side represents your ideas and your feelings, okay? So when we act in ways that we like and that we're comfortable with, then it's not so stretched out. It's like they're incongruent, they're congruent with each other, right? There's no stretch, there's no strain. But when what we do is pulled one way and what we want and what we feel, right, is pulled another way, then there's a lot of stretch and strain between the two. Okay? So in other words, if we start to now hold ourselves to a higher standard and now hold ourselves to go beyond our comfort zone, right? We improve our behaviors to meet this higher standard, then the rubber band is stretching. And unless we get our thoughts and our feelings and our ideas on board with that, we're going to continuously feel this tremendous strain, okay? If we haven't worked on the feelings, right? So like, here's just what I can only imagine as an example, maybe, is like my dad, I think you guys might have heard his story. Anyone who came when he was here, he gave a talk called From Hippie to Chassid, right? So my father was not always observant and he became observant. Now, I could just imagine the first time when he, like his whole life eating not kosher and eating, I think someone asked, like, what do you miss the most? And he mentioned a certain candy bar. I don't even know what it is anymore, right? So there's like a certain chocolate bar that he absolutely loves, right? So imagine he's like, okay, now I'm no longer going to eat this, talking about chocolate. I didn't even think about that. So he's like, okay, now I'm no longer going to eat this chocolate bar. So he's changing his behavior. But if his thought is still like, I want it, I don't get why I'm doing this makes no sense to me, right? There's going to be a strain between the behavior and the thought, between him, like between the quote unquote impulse control the ability to act on that versus on what his brain is telling him. If he has thoughts like, oh, now I'm embracing all of Torah and I'm becoming observant and I want to keep kosher, right? Even if there is still some struggle when he sees the candy bar, it's going to be a lot less of a strain. It's like the rubber band that is not being pulled tight in two opposite directions, right? So when we have that really big pull, it makes us miserable because we're not like we're not getting ourselves on board with each other. In other words, getting our animal soul on board with our godly soul. So actually my mentor, I think I might have mentioned this before, but my mentor says she always likes to, whenever she's doing something inland with her godly soul, she tries to get her animal soul on board. So when she was like, okay, I'm going to get up early at 6 a.m. and I'm going to learn with my husband, right? Now that's a big deal. She's got a lot of kids. That means waking up early. You could be tired. You know, your alarm clock goes off and then her brain's like, I don't want to do this. I just want more sleep. So she's like, how am I going to get my animal soul on board with this idea? She's like, I know what we're going to do. We're going to learn on the porch. So we like see the sunrise and I'm going to have warm cookies and, you know, and a warm drink that I'm going to bring out there with us. Okay, so here's maybe where you would use isapcha and not iskafia, right? She's using the cookies and the warm drink to like entice her to be like, I'm gonna, and she's like, and now I get to look at this as like, you know, some special time I have with my husband. We're gonna sit on the porch. It's gonna be beautiful, and we're gonna learn, and we're gonna have cookies, right? So she's like getting her animal soul on board, so that there isn't such of this stretch between like animal soul saying, let's just sleep. Why would you even do this? Who gets up at 6 a.m. to learn, right? And her godly soul is like, this is a great idea. Let's learn at 6 a.m. So she's like, let's take that rubber band and take away the stretch. Okay, so so when we do have that stretch, these are the different options that could happen when we do have that stretch. So one way of relieving the strain. Now I want you to imagine you do have the strain because this rubber band is very stretched. On the one hand, you have the behavior you want. On the other hand, your ideas and your thoughts and your feelings are not on board with it, right? So one way to relieve that strain is just to backslide. One way is just say, never mind, right? I'm just going to give it up. Okay, and maybe if you tried to do this, you know, this little exercise of working on your Beinoni moments in the past week, maybe you experienced that, okay? So maybe you experience like, okay, I'm going to try not to do this thing, and then you're like, oh, it's so hard, and it takes so much out of me, and so I'm just going to give it up. And that's one way we can do it. But obviously, when we study Tanya, that's not an option. That's not the option we go with. We want something more, right? We don't want to give up on being a better person. And the second option is to keep on doing what we're doing, just keep on doing it and hope that our emotions catch up, right? We could just be like, I'm just going to keep doing this behavior, right? So let's just go back to my mentor who talks about how she, you know, learning at 6 in the morning. Imagine she was like, okay, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to get up. I'm going to get up at 6 a.m. I'm going to do it. And hopefully it's going to be exciting and motivating and I'm going to want to do it and all of that. Hopefully that's just going to happen, right? We're taking out the idea she had of how to get her animal soul on board. Okay. And to some extent, this could work, right? To some extent, we change our habits and then we can become more comfortable with that behavior. Maybe you can kind of get yourself a little bit in tune with, you know, setting your alarm clock early and getting out of bed or whatever it is. But it's not really foolproof because it's hoping, right? It's like, I hope something will work out here. I hope that my emotions will come on board with what I want to do, right? But it still has a risk in there. We could revert back to how we were before. That is definitely a possibility. Or we could sort of like suffer a breakdown in a certain sense because there's such a disconnect between our behavior and our emotion, right? So you can maybe think of that with like a different example where like our behavior, where what we want and what we're thinking about is just so opposite what we're actually doing that the disconnect is so strong that we're just like, I can't do this, right? So.
Hi, excuse me, I'm going to interrupt. One of the things that I'm thinking about is when you want to change a behavior and your friend said she's kind of giving herself a reward by watching the sun come up and having warm cookies. That was an incentive. The other one is somebody told me it takes like, if you want to change, it takes 3 weeks to change, to make a habit.
Yeah.
So make a goal that's reasonable, you know, not like I'm going to run in 1 month, I'm going to run a marathon. Well, you have to do it in steps or, you know, different things. And I think don't set yourself up for failure.
Yeah.
I'm going to do that and realize that if some mornings she wants to sleep in, it's not the end of the world. She can start again. Yeah. I mean, I think you have to kind of talk yourself into behaving well and not make yourself feel bad when you make a mistake.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Making yourself feel bad when you make a mistake actually just puts you further in the opposite direction, right? It doesn't usually motivate you. I stopped screen sharing just so that, and we didn't dig into the handout yet. So I was like, I'll wait so that we can see each other a little better. But yeah, thank you for sharing that, Harriet. Right? So, okay, so now we have these three possibilities of what we can do. We have the two possibilities, and then we will have the possibility that the Tanya gives us, which is obviously the best option, which is to develop feelings and enthusiasm for what we're doing, right? We want to create emotional congruity, right? So we don't want to backslide, and we don't want to like strong arm ourselves into being a Beinoni or into the changes we want to make. We actually want to get our emotions on board with what we're doing so that our insides and our outsides match, right? Our behavior is our outside. Our feelings and the way we approach what we're going to do is our insides. We want those to be in sync with each other so we don't have the strain and the tension, okay? We want internal motivation or internal commitment to maintain these behaviors, right? And that's obviously a lifetime commitment. That's why this is the Beinoni program. The Tanya is a program, not a book. This is a lifelong journey to constantly be involved in, okay? And, okay, so now then we have to talk about if that is true, if we want to get our emotions on board with our behaviors, but then we have to talk about emotional development, right? How do we develop our emotions? How do we get our emotions on board with what we're going to do? Okay, so all of us in our lives have things that we hate to do or dislike, I should say. We strongly dislike, but we do it anyway. I cannot stand making lunches for my kids. It's like my worst job. I do have to give a big shout out to my husband who has been doing lunches ever since Hannah was born. But literally it would become time to make my kids lunches for school the next day, and I would tell myself I'm going to do it the night before and whatever, or it happened, and then of course I don't want to, and I do it in the morning rush, and I just can't stand making lunches, right? So that's just like one example, but some people maybe hate flossing, some people hate brushing their teeth, some people, whatever it is, right? Maybe you don't like cooking, maybe you don't like doing your laundry, whatever it is, right? We all have stuff that we don't like to do. Okay, so then the question is, are there ways to make this job more likable, so to speak, right? That we can get it done in like a timely fashion, right? So for example, maybe if someone doesn't like to recycle, but they then learn about it and they then learn about how good that is for the environment and what, like why it's so important or whatever it is, then it changes their emotion because they kind of like have a new way of looking at it. They're like, I don't like to recycle, but now I learned all about it. And then like they change their emotion about it. They kind of bring their emotions in line with their actions to the point now where they're like, I didn't want to recycle before, but now I do because I learned about why recycling is important. Okay. Just one simple example. You can apply that to anywhere in your life where you think that might apply, right? Most people like to feel for what they're doing, right? We like to want it. It makes it more easier. It makes it more meaningful if we have a feeling for what we're doing, right? So then the question is, how do we get these emotions? And the Tanya tells us there is a long way and a short way to get emotions for what we're doing, to have emotions. There's the long way and the short way. We're going to talk about both. The long way takes 2 chapters of Tanya to describe. This is fascinating. The long way takes 2 chapters. The short way takes 8 chapters to describe in the Tanya, okay? Because the long way is very easy to explain, but years of commitment to get solid results from doing the long way, okay? Very easy to explain, big commitment. The short way is much more complicated, but once you know it, you can just like go out and use it right away, okay? So I think that's fascinating. We're going to talk about both ways, okay? So we're going to start with the long way. Okay, so the long way is this idea of creating new feelings, okay? So imagine one day you got a call that there's like this long lost aunt that lives in Australia that you've never met. You didn't even know she existed. And all of a sudden, she's there. She wants to have a relationship with you. She wants to get to know you, right? And you're like, this new relative that I didn't even know about, that like, right? You don't actually have feelings for her because you don't even know her. You never met her. You didn't even know that there was such a thing as a long lost aunt, right? But then let's say you get on the phone with her and she starts telling you how, actually about when you were a child, and you don't remember this, but she was telling you, has all these warm memories, and she starts telling you about how, all the things she used to do with you when you were a child, and how much she loves you and what she feels about all the rest of her family. And she starts, bringing up all this stuff that could evoke emotions in you that you never had before. All of a sudden you're like, really? I didn't know that I used to like sit on your lap and you'd read me all these stories and that we had this whole connection, because it's just not something that you knew about, or whatever it is, right? So you all of a sudden develop feelings for this aunt, because now you're really thinking about who she is and how you're related and what she means for you in your life and all of that, right? So that's this idea of creating new feelings that literally were not there before, that you now have. I don't know if any of you can like relate to that on some level, not the long lost aunt, unless you have that, but like where you literally had no feeling for something and then it was created from something else. Does anyone have any example that they can think of where they like created new feelings for something?
Well, sometimes if you read a book you don't understand and somebody else can kind of explain to you what it means and what it's about, you can read it and enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You'd be like, like maybe you read it once and you're like, I didn't understand it, I didn't get it. And then someone starts like, like explaining it to you and talking about all the stuff they love about it. And then you can all of a sudden be like, I'm going to read it with new eyes, or I'm going to, or now, now I get it, how deep it is, how special it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I actually use Chabad classes to create a reality for myself, to change my mind over the years. They're created by, if you will, different islands. I create a class, or a class is created for me, and I use that as an island, as a stepping stone. And I step through the week. Monday I have three actually, and Wednesday and Tuesday and Thursday and Friday is Shabbos. So the whole week sustains me, and over time that really changes my focus
Mm-hmm.
in a very positive way.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. That's really special. Yeah, and that's right what we said before. Chabad is an acronym. That's what it stands for, right? Chachma bina da, wisdom, understanding, knowledge. The idea that if we start with our mind generates our emotions, right? So when we meet people that are like, I don't believe in God, I don't get God, God is just like this evil concept, or I don't know, whatever, right? To me, my first response is always like, do you know God? Like, have you learned about God? Like where is this coming from, right? Versus like, how much are we actually like delving into understanding God, right? Like, in other words, the first step to even belief and emotion and all of that could be learning about God. Although this is under the long way of Tanya, which we're going to talk about, right? But the idea that, yes, if you learn about it, you can generate emotion for anything, right? Like the simple example of the recycling I gave before. I could be like, oh, who cares about recycling? That's a waste of time. And then I learn about it and I could be like, oh, I get why it's so important. Now I'm going to recycle, right? Just that's like a simple idea. Yes. So I'm going to.
I have, which is kind of like what you were talking about. I didn't know that I had any relatives in England.
Mm-hmm.
My mother knew, they were part of her family, but when I got to know them, and I got to know she was a kinder transport. She was sent from Germany, never saw her family again. 5 of them died in Auschwitz. It was like I had a whole different appreciation for this woman.
Mm.
And now we're like buddies. I mean, she's in her 90s, but
Wow.
it doesn't matter because, we send each other cards, we email each other. I have this very warm feeling for somebody I had no idea existed.
Yeah.
And she's the daughter of my grandfather's first cousin. And so it wasn't part of my reality until I actually met her and started, developing the relationship with her, which is in my life. I mean, I don't talk to her about the Holocaust because it's painful for her. She was trying to write a lot of stuff down, and her daughters, who were in their 50s, said, you know what, we've just let that go. Mm-hmm. Because, it's not good for her. Yeah. And she's trying to live a nice life in England. So I get it. But I mean, I'm warm with her, but not about that. But it changed my whole thought about the Holocaust, that it was so close to me, and about this woman who went through it, who's my relative, that I had and survived.
Amazing. These are such great examples. So, right, so it takes 2 chapters in the Tanya to explain the long way. And if I would tell you what the long way is in one word, it's contemplation. Okay? When we contemplate on something, or in Hebrew, maybe you're familiar with this word, hitbonenut. Hitbonenut is kind of like meditation, right? But the idea of like deeply contemplating on something, deeply thinking about something. When we deeply think about something, we can generate emotion for it. Okay? So, okay, so that is, and now I'm going to actually go back to sharing my screen so we can dive into text number 1. Okay, so here, okay, so text number 1, now we're already at, again, I told you this is like a 6-week overview of Tanya, right? The crash course of Tanya, not doing chapter by chapter in depth. So we're already at chapter 16, class number 3. In class number 3. Okay, so text number 1, do you want to read that for us, Nancy?
Text number 1, Tanya, chapter 16. The important principle regarding the divine service of the Beinanim is to govern and rule the animal nature by intellectually contemplating the greatness of the infinite, so as to create through understanding a spirit of knowledge and awe of God in his mind, which will cause him to turn away from evil, and a love of God in his heart, which will cause him to cleave by God by fulfilling the precepts of the Torah.
Okay, right. So here it's saying what is going to make us understand the greatness of God to the point where we're going to, our love is going to motivate us to do what God wants, and our awe is going to motivate us to not transgress what God wants, right? What is going to do that? It's by intellectual contemplation. And then you can ask, well, how much contemplation, right? Like how much of our intellect has to be on board with this or whatever, how to motivate us to do the right thing. And you don't have to become overwhelmingly emotional when you think about God, just enough to generate some appreciation that serving God is important, right? Just enough. Our feelings just have to motivate us to action. All right. So it doesn't have to be, obviously there's a whole spectrum in here, but here it's saying just enough to motivate us to action. That's as much as it would take to contemplate God. Okay. Text number 2, Robin, do you want to read that for us?
Hang on just a second. I'm just taking a note. Just enough to motivate us to action. Okay. Furthermore, one must know an additional important principle in the Benoni service of God. Even if one's intellect and understanding are incapable of producing a revealed love of God in his heart, as long as he comprehends the greatness of the infinite, this is completely acceptable. For it is this appreciation that leads him to engage in the Torah and mitzvot.
Right. So here's just saying like a certain amount to understand, wow, like God is so great, right? But like literally that could be the sentence. God is so great and I want to serve God. And that could just be enough, like a little bit of appreciation, a little bit of like, this is enough now to get me to engage in learning Torah or doing a mitzvah, right? Okay. Then let's talk about text number 3. Let's see, Barbara, do you want to read that for us? Weird, because it doesn't say your,
I'm sorry.
There you
go. To arouse a love which remains hidden in the heart is very easy and very near to every person who has a brain. For his mind is under his control, even if his heart is not. And he can meditate with it as he pleases on any subject. Thus, if he uses it to contemplate the greatness of the Almighty, he will inevitably generate, in his mind at least, a love of God and cleave to him through the performance of his commandments and the study of his Torah.
Okay, thank you. Right, so here again, we're talking about this idea that it doesn't need to be some like overwhelming love, right? Just enough of an appreciation, enough of an understanding that is going to impact your actions, right? So here are the pros and the cons of the long way, right? And again, the long way in one word would be contemplation. Hits bone and notes, really deeply contemplating on God. So the pro the pro of this is that over time, so it takes a long time, but over time it can lead to appreciation that creates lasting change, right? You can so think about something that might be deeply important to you today that was not important to you 10 years ago, right? It's lasting change. Now this thing, whatever that is now important to you, and it creates lasting change. But likely the change did not come quickly, right? It's gradual shifts. It's over time. It's with a lot of education, a lot of contemplation, right? But it's lasting change. And then again, the con of this long way is that it can be slow. It can take a long time, right? Adopting new attitudes can sometimes be a very slow process, okay? So now we're going to talk about what is the short way. What is the short way? The short way helps us to actually muster the motivation while we're waiting to see results from contemplation. So it doesn't mean just do one way over another. Of course, contemplation is important. For example, like I said, when we have people that are like, I don't understand God, I don't get God, I don't believe in God, I don't want anything to do with this God thing. Actually, I had when I was in 7th grade, I had an English teacher. She wasn't even Jewish. She an English teacher who we asked her, like little 7th graders, I'm like, do you believe in God? And she said no. And then she's like, well, actually, and then I said, why? And she's like, well, actually, I just don't think about it. She's like, I don't have time to think about it. Like, I'm too busy. I would have to make the time to think about it. And if I thought about it, this is what she said, if I thought about it, I might come to the conclusion that there is a God. And if I come to the conclusion that there is a God, I might come to the conclusion that he wants something from me. And if I come to the conclusion that he wants something from me, I might have to change something in my life. Okay. That was the end of the conversation. It has stuck with me till today because I found that so half mind-boggling and just half, like, I was like a little blown away by the answer. Like, in other words, let's just not think about it, right? Because then what's the road it's gonna lead me down? So I'd rather just not think about it. So no, I don't believe in God, right? So yeah, this concept, in other words, the idea of contemplation could take time. It could take time to then develop, right? She's like, I don't have time for it. Her line of thinking was almost like on point in a way, right? So we're not saying don't do the long way because it could take a long time, but we're like, but you also don't have to wait for the long way in order to already, tap into your emotions and behaviors and change some things, okay? So the short way is going to help us while we're waiting to see results from contemplation. So yes, we can still do the contemplation. We can still take the time to think about these things. But what is the short way in the process? Okay. So for example, my husband, as many of you might know, is a hockey fan. He absolutely loves hockey because he's from Canada. And my boys love hockey. My 2 boys, they love to play hockey. The 3 of them watch hockey together. I have zero, I'm not going to say zero. I used to have literally like 0 interest in hockey. Okay. Because it was like not even on my radar. It wasn't a thing. I didn't even know about it. Right now, I'm not going to say I'm a huge hockey fan anymore, but after almost 11 years of marriage, 11, I think 12. Oh my gosh, we're almost at 12 years. We're almost getting to our 12-year anniversary. So almost at 12 years of marriage, I could say that with this much exposure to hockey, right? I now, like, when I hear that the Canadians won a game, I'm like, yay, the Canadians won, right? Or when they're all like watching something and they all cheer for a score, I'm like, yes, the score, right? Like there's like some more of me on board with that, right? So if we go to that example, right, this idea that I went from literally not caring to having some measure of caring about the Canadians and the hockey. And again, obviously, I'm just using a silly example, and you can take this to your service of God or however you want, right? So now, why do I care? Because I'm married to a Canadian, because he loves hockey, because I care about what he loves, because they generate excitement in the household, and so I want to be part of that excitement, right? Like I can say, like, these are the things that now have led me to be somewhat more of a hockey lover or whatever it is, right? Of a hockey fan to some extent, right? So now, just by virtue of the fact that you are Jewish and that you contain a godly soul inside of you, just by virtue of that fact, right? You're already on your way to having this technically full blown out, all over love and appreciation for God and for Torah and for mitzvot, right? In other words, you already have some of that inside of you. Okay, I can't quite make the analogy to the hockey. It doesn't quite work as an analogy, but in other words, you have a godly soul inside of you. So when someone tells me like I don't even believe that there is such a thing as a Jewish atheist, because you can say you're an atheist, not a problem. And I don't mean this in like a mean way, like, but when someone tells me like, oh, I'm an atheist, I'm like, okay, but I still know that they still have a godly soul inside of them, and that godly soul is actually a piece of God, and you don't deny a piece of your own self, and so like somewhere inside of them there is a belief in God, whether they want to acknowledge it or not, whether they're aware of it or not, right? And I say that with love. I don't mean to say like I'm going to discount the person and their emotions. I'm just saying like you have it inside of you. It's like this piece of you already, okay? I'm just going to pause in case there's any questions. I feel like I might be going a little fast. Any questions? Anyone want to jump in?
I
Yeah.
have a question for if the child is, say you're talking to a child who's, kind of interested in God, and their mother isn't Jewish and their father is, and asks about God. I'm sure you've had this kind of situation.
Yeah.
What's the appropriate thing to do? Because, part of them, there is a Jew in their lineage. It's just not their mother.
Yeah. So there's like the Jewish aspect, but what you're saying is there's one God in the world, and that is a God of all of humanity and of the whole world, right? We don't have a different God than someone who isn't Jewish. There's one God who created the entire world with a purpose and a plan, and has a specific mission for everyone in that. So if you're Jewish, here's what I want from you. If you're not Jewish, here's what I want from you. Right? So 100%. And one of the 7 Noahide laws is to believe in God. So when you're saying, well, what if there's a kid that's asking about God and the mother is not Jewish and the father is, it doesn't like that in that context, it doesn't matter. Like, of course that child should learn about God and what God wants from them in this world, right? Living with morals and living with values and what their role is in the world. Nothing to do with Judaism. Right?
Thank you.
Yeah. So, okay, so the short way is about arousing the hidden love of God, the inherent hidden love of God. So we're not, so the first way, right, we said contemplation, it's creating something new. The short way is arousing the love that's already there. It's already there, and now we're just going to arouse it, right? So, okay, so let's go actually to text number 4. This is already in chapter 18. And let's see, Harriet, do you want to read that for us?
Yes. Even for the person who has only a limited understanding of God's greatness and does not have sufficient emotional capacity to generate through contemplation and understanding of the awe and love he should feel for God, it is still a very near thing for him to guard and to practice all the commandments of the Torah, as well as the study of Torah, by accessing the hidden love already present in the heart of all Jews bequeathed to us from our patriarchs.
Thank you. Okay, so what do we learn over here from this is that this is in our DNA, right? That it's in the DNA of our souls, I should put it. It's the DNA of our souls passed down from our foremothers and our forefathers, right? But it's in our DNA, but we have to activate it, right? So imagine there's a bird who has wings. The bird has the capacity to fly, but in order to activate that part of themselves, they have to flap their wings. They got to actually fly to fly, right? Even if they have the capacity to fly. So imagine like if there was like a mother who, God forbid, her child got trapped underneath a huge heavy car, right? And she goes over, like her kid is like screaming underneath the car, and she goes over, she lifts up the car to get her kid out, right? And that has actually happened before. So imagine you call this mother and you're like, listen, I have this huge washer dryer and I need you to like bring it up 3 flights of stairs. Okay. She's gonna be like, what are you talking about? I can't do that. I'm not able to do that. Right. So you're like, what are you talking about? You lifted up this car and your kid was under it. You can't like schlep my washer dryer up 3 flights of stairs. In that moment, when her kid was trapped under the car, it was like adrenaline that just motivated her and got her to just be like, I'm saving my kid's life. She wasn't thinking about it. She wasn't like, contemplating on it. She was just like, pick up the car, get the kid out from under the car. But when you ask her to like do something like that, there's no way that she can even fathom doing something like that, right? So we have that in our spiritual sense. When does our spiritual instinct, so that was like her motherly instinct kicked in, we have spiritual instinct. When does it kick in? In the same place that this mother's motherly instinct kicks in, which is matters of life and death. Okay? So when it's a matter of not physical life and death, like with the mother-child example, but spiritual life and death, when a Jew feels that the essential connection to God is being threatened, then that person will do anything to preserve that bond, including giving up their physical life. And I'm not saying something so out of the ordinary, because we have so many instances in history when exactly this happened. When Jews were told convert or die, and they maybe never even practiced their Judaism. They maybe even never cared about their Judaism, but at that moment when they were told convert or die, they chose death because they could not imagine converting out of their faith, right? We have so many instances in history where things like that happened. So when a Jew feels that their spiritual connection to God is being threatened, that is when this like connection, this spiritual idea, this inherent thing in them comes out to the fore, this like spiritual adrenaline that they could never do through contemplation. It's not going to work through contemplation. It's just like that in the moment comes out kind of a thing. Okay, that's going to take us to text number 5. Andrea, do you want to read that for us?
Five. Therefore, generally speaking, even the most careless sinners among Israel sacrifice their lives for the sanctity of God's name and suffer harsh torture rather than deny God's unity, even if they are unlearned and ignorant of God's greatness. Their self-sacrifice does not result from any knowledge or contemplation of God, but rather without any reason or rational argument whatsoever.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now we see from here, right? So every single Jewish person has this inherited instinctive feeling for God, okay? It has nothing to do with how much you've learned or how much you've contemplated godliness, okay? Every single Jew has this inherent, passed down through our spiritual DNA, connection to God, okay? Now, when does it come out is when it's put to the test, right? We don't want to be separated from God. We don't want to hurt our relationship with God, right? It's not logical. It's like a spiritual reflex. It's not a logical thing. It's like a survival mechanism of our godly soul. We have a godly soul that, to the godly soul, it means death to be separated from godliness. Okay? It's spiritual death for the godly soul. It would never, ever, ever willingly choose that. Okay? Just like a mother would never willingly choose to just watch her child die, right? A healthy mother. Now, if she didn't know that her child was pinned under the car, she can't do anything about it, right? If she didn't know about it, she doesn't know that her child's life is in danger, she doesn't have that thing to run to, right? That she's not going to go run there. So how is it then that we could do something against God's will is when we don't know what that thing actually represents. So it's very, very easy for us to rationalize ourselves. We can say things like, God doesn't really care about this. This can't really be that important to God. Come on, right? This is not really going to affect my relationship with God. When we have thoughts like that, then we don't think that this thing could mean, quote unquote, spiritual death or disconnection to God. And so it's very easy for that natural spiritual reflex, right? The survival mechanism of like, there is no way I would willingly choose separation from God. It doesn't kick in because we've rationalized that it doesn't actually matter. That's not really what this means. God couldn't possibly care about something so small, etc. Right? Yes.
I have a question. So in Deuteronomy, where it says choose life, I take that to mean that God wants us to live and to teshuva, to come back to him,
yeah,
which is a theme of Netzavim and Deuteronomy. So how do you square that with what chapter 18 of Tanya?
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, sorry, a great question. So yes, when you say choose life, you're meaning in the physical sense, like we need to stay alive and we want to choose life. Now, that is always the case, that we want to choose life over any other quote unquote transgression in the Torah, except for 3 instances. there are only 3 instances where we are supposed to choose death over transgressing these mitzvot. Okay? The 3 are murdering somebody else. So if someone says, you murder them or I'll murder you, right? We choose death over willingly murdering somebody else. The second one is idol worship. If someone says, serve this idol, bow down to this idol, or I will kill you, right? It's essentially like convert to another religion. Again, convert to another religion or I will kill you, right? So we had, like in the Spanish Inquisition, we had Marranos, which were Jews that outwardly said they converted, but inwardly practiced Judaism and secretly practiced Judaism, right? Okay. But we're talking about someone who is like giving it up. We're talking about like, I am now going to worship this thing, or I'm now going, right? Like choose that or I will kill you. We choose death over idol worship. And then the third one is adultery, right? So if someone is like, those are the top 3, right? So if someone is like, or any form of a intimate relationship, a sexual relationship that we are not allowed to have, right? So if someone says, go, allow me to rape you, I don't allow me to rape you, I guess, whatever, like I'm going to sleep with you or choose death, that kind of thing, right? You choose death. Okay. So those are the only 3 where we would choose the opposite of life over transgressing these mitzvot. Anything else, if someone is like, you need to, violate Shabbat or else I'm going to kill you or whatever, we would violate Shabbat. Or you need to like eat this non-kosher thing or whatever it is, right? So yes, in general, life takes 100% precedence over anything else except for these 3 instances. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So, right, so here we have what we're saying is that how could it be, right? So people who would not generally make sacrifices for their Judaism will suddenly give it all up rather than to renounce God, right? Is because of this, again, inherent spiritual DNA. They are like, I will not separate myself from godliness and I would rather choose death. But then when that doesn't kick in is when we think, oh, it's just a little thing, or, oh, God just doesn't really care, or it's not really that important, right? We think like this is a big thing, but this thing is not a big thing, right? So that's when that spiritual reflex doesn't necessarily kick in the same way, right? And then our spiritual connection is in jeopardy, okay? And so like I just explained, there are, according to Jewish law, there are priorities in mitzvot, right? In the certain sense that there are some, like I said, the top 3 that rather be killed than transgress these or whatever it is. That's very different than when we decide something is no big deal, right? So just think about it. When you love someone, you are not going to willingly, intentionally, knowingly hurt them. Usually when we hurt someone or offend someone or whatever, we didn't mean to, when we have so much love for them, right? So it's kind of like this idea here, okay? So from that perspective, any transgression, big or small, can sever us from our connection to godliness. Okay, and again, I don't say this in like this big scary way. I actually like to focus on the positive. But if you look at it, like any action we take can either bind us to God or separate us from God. And yes, we have a very kind and loving God, and we have the concept of teshuvah and all of that, which we'll talk about. But I just want you to look at it like any single action we take can bind us to God or sever us from God. Any action. So right now, every single one of you are learning Torah. Every single one of you right now are binding yourself to God, right? So again, I think I gave this imagery in last class. Like if you can imagine like 613 strands going from like your heart, let's say, to God, right? You're connected by 613 strands. And every time you do a mitzvah, you're like strengthening the strand. And every time we do the opposite of that, right? We might be like snipping the strand, right? So we're either like strengthening our connection, severing our connection, strengthening our connection, severing our connection, right? We just don't always think of it like that in the moment. Like I am literally severing my connection with God when I do this thing. If we really thought about that, we would have the spiritual, the spiritual reflex of absolutely not will I choose to sever my connection with God. That's like spiritual suicide for our godly soul. It would never willingly choose that. So the only reason we do willingly choose that is actually is because a spirit of folly. And this is actually from a Hasidic mimer talking about like what would make us do something, like say a juicy piece of gossip. It's like only because a spirit of folly enters us. ruach stus. Stus is like stupidity. It's like no one in their right mind knowing what willingly saying a piece of gossip actually does on a spiritual level. No one in their right mind would willingly do that. It's only because we have like, I don't know if you ever heard the word stus, but it's like only because this like feeling of stupidity overcame us that we don't actually know what we're doing, where we're like, oh, come on, it's not a big deal. You think God actually cares, right? Some version of that is happening in our conscious or subconscious, that then we're like, of course I'm going to do this, because we don't actually know the spiritual ramification. But if we actually understood, and this can go back to the contemplation, if we actually understood the spiritual ramifications, we would never, in our right mind, that's why it's called a real stus, it's like our stupid mind, our folly mind, whatever, would willingly do that, okay? So the short way, so we have the long way, which is contemplation, and the short way is to recognize, is to like jumpstart that spiritual reflex, to recognize that every single sin, every single, I don't like using the word sin. I don't like, anyways, but I think you all understand the spirit of how I'm explaining this. I don't like to, we definitely always love to focus on the positive, and sin sometimes sounds like a just really like scary word. But if you just look at it as an action that severs, that creates a separation between me and God, right? Just, it puts me in the opposite direction of that really strong connection I'm trying to create. Okay. If we just look at it like that, the short way is to recognize that every sin threatens our relationship with God, so that, right? So we can react to every spiritual challenge as if we were faced with the challenge of martyrdom, right? Imagine that when your animal soul is like, share this juicy piece of lashon hara, this juicy piece of gossip, and you know it and you're aware of it, right? Imagine that was the same thing as it saying, convert or die, or no, yeah, like, right? Convert or die, and that was the same choice being made. Because that is what it is. And that's the short way, is to jumpstart understanding that that this action literally creates a snip in that relationship with God. The same way converting does. The same way bowing down to an idol does. The same way an act of murder does. Right? Now, your brain might be like, what? There's no way it's the same. You cannot compare murder to a juicy piece of gossip, right? But if you think about it, yeah.
I have a question, because there's in our world right now, there's a lot of talk about racial injustice, and how African Americans have suffered through different ways in our country.
Yeah.
And like, we're trying to make sure that we recognize we have played a part in some of it, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Anyway, I'm thinking it doesn't have to be really bad gossip, but I was just thinking that sometimes I've heard jokes that are really nasty jokes. I mean, they're referring to another group of people in a really negative way.
Yeah.
And that perpetuates bad things. And I'm thinking we need to maybe expand this thought, so that we even think about joking. You know, we don't make fun of people by making jokes about this thing.
Yeah.
And I think that makes more sense than gossip as a word, because then we get into what is gossip and we talk about things, but treating people with respect is really important.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up.
Treating all people with respect.
Yeah. All people with respect. And I appreciate that you brought that up, Harriet, because it's like under every mitzvah, there is an entire world of how you actually fulfill that mitzvah, right? So we like, lashon hara just means evil talk, right? That's like literally like the exact translation of lashon hara. Lashon is like tongue and hara is bad, right? So bad talk, evil talk. So now we're like, well, what falls under that category? And then you could have a million questions. What about if it's does it only mean speech? Or what about if I write about it? What if you write an article for a newspaper? What about if you write it in a letter to your best friend? What you're like, and there's just so much, right? What if you say it like this? What if it's just a joking comment? You don't really mean it. What, like the whole gamut. There is halacha, which halacha is Jewish law on exactly all of this. There's we have books on our bookshelf called like guard your tongue, literally an entire book on that, right? So And I think actually one time when I said, what do you guys want to learn next or something like that, I think Adrian might have brought up, like, I would love to learn like the interpersonal details of these kind of mitzvot, right? So I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm just like throwing out an example. But what I really mean, but really it has so much in it, right? Like, it doesn't just mean like Torah says, don't share a piece of juicy gossip, right? There's actually so much under how we speak. And it's, again, Torah is a lifetime of learning. And so it's a lifetime of constantly learning these things, right? We can learn something new like all the time, where I'm like, oh, I didn't know that fell under this category, right? So also being a Beinoni probably means that we want to be learning all the time, so we actually know how to be, like, what the Torah does want from us, right? What God does want from us. So I appreciate that you brought that up. Okay, so let's do the next couple of texts. Let's see, I think everyone with their video on had a chance to read. So I'll read this one, and then we can maybe go with round 2. Okay, text number 6. In truth, even he who commits a minor sin transgresses the divine will and is completely separated from God's unity and oneness at the time he commits the transgression, right? So we're talking about, we like to sometimes make our own calculations. This is minor, this is major, this mitzvah is important, this one's not so important. But no, they're all, every single one of them, at the time that we do them, creates a distance in our relationship, okay? And I'll do text number 7 as well. At any time and moment, a person can arouse his love of the one God that is undoubtedly latent in his heart, right? We have this in our hearts. It's not something you need to create. It's already there. This is the meaning of it is near to you in your heart. This love also contains an aspect of fear. That is the dread of being separated from God's unity and oneness, even if it means sacrificing his life without any reason or logic, but purely out of one's godly nature. Surely it's far easier to subdue one's appetite than to endure the suffering of death, yet he would readily do that if need be, right? So we spoke about that, this idea that I'm like, if I knew knowing what this means, right? Death on a physical level, I would rather choose that. Death on a spiritual level, I can never choose that, right? So, the choices we make when we arouse this hidden love of God, arousing our hidden love and our hidden awe and fear of God at the same time. He will thus be moved to obey God's will, even when it concerns a minor rabbinic prohibition, quote unquote, right? We like to make these calculations. It's just minor. Oh, it's just from the rabbis. Oh, it's just this, it's just that. Since at the time that he does the forbidden act, he becomes separated from God's unity just as much as through actual idolatry, right? It's a little mind-blowing to be like, we're not making differences here. Separation is separation, right? So just, you can think about this in the context of maybe a relationship, right? That is very near and dear to you, like a loving relationship, a spousal relationship, right? So if your spouse, let's say, says to you, I really, really, really cannot stand dirty dishes in the sink. It is like my pet peeve. It's just, everything about a dirty dish in the sink drives me crazy, or whatever it is, right? I might be like, listen, I don't get it. I don't understand. I don't think it's a big deal. But for the sake of my spouse, for the sake of the relationship, I don't want to, I want to wash the dishes and not leave dirty dishes in the sink because I know how much it means to you and I don't want to create that distance, right? It could, again, silly examples, but whatever it is, it doesn't have to make sense to us. It's like, I don't want to create that rift in our relationship, and therefore, for your sake, I'm going to do it. For the sake of the relationship, okay? Let's see, text number 8. Do you want to read that for us, Nancy?
Sure. I don't know. Likewise, in the category of, quote, doing good, he will be able to strengthen himself like a lion with might and determination of heart against the evil nature which weighs down his body. It is very easy for a person to resist and subjugate his nature when he considers that he is doing so, when he considers that doing so is much less painful than enduring the pangs of his death. May God preserve us, yet he would lovingly and willingly have accepted the pain of death. May God preserve us, so as not to be separated from God's unity and oneness, even for a moment, by an act of idolatry, God forbid. Certainly then, he ought to lovingly and willingly accept any inconvenience or burden in order to bind himself to God with an eternal bond.
Okay, right? So here again, we see that this idea that if we knew that this act connects me to God and therefore I want to do it, we would be doing all of that. And if we knew, and this act severs me from God in that moment, right? It affects my relationship with God, we would never willingly choose to do that. Okay. And again, you can use the same concept maybe in a loving relationship or in a marriage, right? Where I'm like, if I knew that this act is going to really hurt my relationship, I'm not going to do it. And if I knew that this act is going to really be really supportive and loving and good for my relationship, I am going to do it. Right. And choosing the opposite, like if you knew that this act is going to sever your relationship, but you're like, but I'm going to just do it anyway, it does send a message to the other person like, I don't really care what is super important to you. Maybe a little bit, maybe when it's convenient for me, maybe when I want to do it, right? But it sends a certain message where it's like, I value my own, thoughts and feelings in this moment rather than the actual relationship that we are building together. That idea. And I'm just using that analogy because maybe it's a little bit more relatable than to understand about our relationship with God in that sense. Okay. Whoop. Where's text number 9? No. Uh-oh. I have some cutoff on our handout. I don't know where that went. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to say the rest outside before we go into the key points. Okay. So here, right, we don't, the gradations of sin don't actually matter, right? Because at that moment, it's not about the gradations, it's about the message we are imparting. The same way we impart a message in our loving relationship of like, I love you and therefore I'm going to do this for you, or I don't really care how you're feeling right now. Like we send a message by the actions we take or don't take. It's the same thing in our relationship with God, right? What we choose to do or not do sends a message about how we're showing up in our relationship with God. And so back to triggering the instinct, right? With that instinct, we all have this instinctual need to connect to God and desire to connect to God, right? How do we trigger that is from reminding ourselves what it means when we do the opposite, when we either give into this urge or do this thing that we know, right? We want to like remind ourselves of what's actually happening here. Okay. So I know that this has been kind of, I feel like focusing a lot more about this idea of like sin or doing the opposite of what God wants, but like, let's move away from that for a moment and talk about really the positive things, right? This exact same technique can be used to motivate us to do all the positive things, right? To get off, like, let's say I'm just like relaxing on the couch and I'm like, oh, it's time to light Shabbat candles, but whatever, I'm exhausted. It's been a long day. I'm just on the couch. Doesn't matter that it's candle lighting time, right? The same technique can be used to motivate ourselves to get off the couch and just go light the Shabbat candles. We're like, hold on a second. I get to connect to God in this moment in the most beautiful way, in the way that God wants a connection, in a way of transcending my own desire to just stay on the couch, right? And just like kind of give into my urge in that moment. I have this opportunity right now to like really feed my godly soul and connect to God. That can be used again to jumpstart that like desire, that love, that motivation to be like, no. I even though my animal soul is like, just stay on the couch and relax and rest. You deserve it. You had a long day. It's hard, right? That same thing can be channeled towards like, I'm going to just go light these Shabbat candles right now, right? So the same way that we can think about the momentary separation caused by transgression, we can think about the incredible connection and opportunity we have to connect to God by doing a mitzvah, right? And that is, again, enough just to like, we just want that jump start, because the long way is the contemplation, but the short way is like, we need something in the moment to just like jumpstart us, to just get us off our tush, right? Light a fire under our tushy, right? That's really what we're going for here. So again, we started off this class really by talking about what changes you might have seen in your life from like, I used to not care about this and now I do, right? Or I used to care about this and now I don't. Whatever it is, like I've used contemplation or I've used learning or education as a way to now have a different emotion inside of me, right? That kind of thing. And those might be changes that took a long time to make, right? I'm still going on 12 years of becoming a hockey fan versus right? But at the same time, it maybe took a long time to make, but it's also very likely lasting, right? Once you've done the long way of making that change, it's also usually a lasting change inside of you. And then there's other changes that you might have made the short way, right? Where it's just like in the moment, what got me to like do that thing that my spouse wanted me to do? What got me to do that thing for my kids, even though I literally had no interest in doing that thing for my kids? Could have been like a thought, right? Like, I'm a mother. This is what we do. Like, this is how I'm going to show up for my kids right now, even though I don't want to, or whatever it is, right? And so, like, I actually remember when I was I was like 15, and I had to go at that point in order to get my license. I was going to 4 days, 8 hours a day of driving school practice, like not driving practice, of like school education, like what's it called? Driver's ed. I was going to driver's ed. I don't know if it's still like that, but I literally had to go for 8 hours a day for 4 days for driver's ed. And they were talking about the need for seatbelts, right? So the idea for seatbelts can be like this nice conceptual idea of like, yeah, we're supposed to wear a seatbelt. It's good for safety, all of that. They had somebody come in and talk to us, somebody who was paralyzed from the waist down, come in and talk to us about an accident he was in because he didn't put on his seatbelt. He wasn't even driving. He was like 17 years old, and his friends were, going out for a drive, and he was in the back seat, and they were just all having fun. He didn't put on his seatbelt, got into an accident, went through the windshield, and he was paralyzed from the waist down from then on. And literally, that is all it took. That one story, that one interaction with this man, where I will not drive in the car ever without my seatbelt on. And I'm like, everyone knows, right? It's like we could be like going out of the driveway in my house, and I'm like, Menachem, your seatbelt's not on yet, And he's like, we just got in the car. I'm like, doesn't matter, right? Like, that is it. It just took that like one thing for me, that one piece of like visual and hands-on education to be like, that's it, seatbelt's on, right? So that's behavioral change that can happen in one instant. Right? It didn't take me years of learning about the importance of seatbelts, and years of watching traffic accidents, and years of looking at statistics for me to like literally just associate this one thing I learned to this behavior that is now ingrained in me since I was 15, right? So now we have 2 methods for emotional congruity, okay? Which is how we're going to take our emotions and catch them up to our behaviors, how we're going to take our rubber bands and make it not so strained, and make it that it's not so hard for us, right? The long way, through contemplation; the short way, to tap into our instinctive emotions, okay? And we can do the long way, but we have to be very patient for the results. And we can do the short way, and we can see success immediately. And of course, we actually want to do it both simultaneously. That's what I recommend, right? So I'm going to challenge you that sometime during this week to pick something you're grappling with, pick any issue you're grappling with, and try to use the short way. Use the short way and see if it can reduce tension in making a decision. See if you can like jumpstart that part of you where it's just like I got this in me, and I'm going to make a decision. That is going to be my challenge to you. Okay, so we're going to just recap things that we spoke about in this class, and then I'll open up to any questions before we end. So impulse control alone is very difficult when our impulses are not consonant with our actions. So we have to work on ways to build emotional congruity. There are 2 methods for doing so. The Tanya talks about both of them, which are best used in combination. There's the long way and the short way. The long way consists of comprehensive study or contemplation, creating feelings through knowledge. It takes a lot of time to take effect, but its effects are lasting. The short way involves tapping into our latent, natural feelings of love and yearning for God. These feelings of love and yearning for God come to the fore when our connection with God is under threat. Therefore, one can arouse these feelings by viewing each mitzvah as an opportunity to connect with God, and by viewing any transgression as, God forbid, threatening that connection with God. And number 4, the advantage of the short way as compared with the long way is its quick results, though its effects can also wane with similar speed. Okay, so that really sums up these next collection of chapters in Tanya, to help us where we understand what a Beinoni does, and we're like, yeah, but how do we actually do that? How do we actually get our emotions on board with change, right? But the Beinoni is in control of all of their behaviors. And behaviors, I mean thought, speech, and action, right? All the modes of expression, but how do we get ourselves on board with keeping our thought, speech, and action in check? And that is what we covered in today's class. So I'm going to cancel the spotlight and let anyone else jump in if you have anything to share, add.
I'm going to have to go.
Okay.
Thank you. This is really great.
Perfect.
And I
Perfect.
really like this. It's
Yes,
helped me.
Harriet got the map of the Tanya.
Yes.
Right? I showed you
and
like that kind of
it
like
makes
picture of that
sense.
brochure. Yeah.
It's
Mapping it, right? It's
keeping
like a
me
brochure,
learning.
but it's like this long map that sort of really breaks it down.
And it helps. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Where did you get that from?
I ordered it.
From?
I don't know. From I did a search and it's from a Jewish bookstore someplace.
And it's called The Map of the Tanya?
Yes, The Map of Tanya. It's by it's published. Whoa. And they were really nice. They sent a note that they sent it early. I mean, it would have taken longer, but
Who
it's
published it?
someplace in Brooklyn, order department, compiled. Yeah.
Brooklyn.
Map of Tanya Pocket Edition. KEHOT Publication Society.
Oh, Keyhoe.
God.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
That's the Chabad publishing
Thank
company.
you. See you next.
Love it. All right. Bye, Harriet. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Does anyone else have any questions or anything before we end for today?
You're going to send us the recap that you just went over, like you did for 1 and 2.
Send the handouts.
You know, like
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me make a note
Yes.
for myself to do that so that I can. I'll put them all on the website, and then that way you can like link to them. I'll put all the
good.
handouts
Very good.
for
Good.
everyone.
Thank you
Great.
very much, Adina.
My pleasure. All right.
Yeah.
So
Good seeing
we have
everybody.
Kvel and Kvetch in that
Yeah.
order on Monday at 1 o'clock if you want to join. And then next week, the 28th is that next week? Is the challah bake on Thursday. So if you want to join the over 500 women baking challah together, Northern California women, you can join with a challah kit and have stuff with you, or you can just join and then bring your own stuff, or even just to watch. And you can register at norcalchallahbake.com. And then we'll have Torah Tea again next Wednesday at 1 o'clock.
I won't be there on Monday because I have a conflict. I have another Zoom that's recurring at 1 o'clock on Monday. So
Right.
Too bad.
Good. Do your learning. Fantastic.